All right, so lab for next week for lab 7 is all about getting data from one place into another. So basically, you're going to learn about tools like extract values to points, where you get the value of a raster grid into the corresponding sort of point that's on top of each pixel. You're going to learn a spatial join, which is to get attribute information from a polygon into a point location that's sitting on top of that. Um, you're going to learn a tool called zonal statistics as table. I don't know why it's called that long thing, but basically the idea behind that is if you have a polygon shape, is to get information about the raster grid that's underlying it. Like, for example, the average number of ones, trues within that polygon. There's one other thing that you're not going to do in lab 7, but is important to think about because GIS integrates really well with the idea of sampling. So I just want to talk to you briefly about sampling strategies and how that interacts with GIS. So some of the data that are available to you for final projects include GPS collar data or museum records like locations of plants or barium records or places where people have identified plants or animals. So in those cases, these data already exist. You don't have any control over the sampling strategy. But the question is, you may at some point decide, oh, actually, I need to learn something about the habitat of this animal. I'm trying to, understand something about where this plant distribution exists, and you actually need to go out and collect some samples to inform that. And so the question is, okay, I want to go out and put a camera trap. I'm looking for certain species or trying to understand the diversity of animals. I want to go out and run some point transects to understand, how many of these rare plant species are in an area. So how can GIS help with that type of sampling where you're actually deciding where on the landscape you're going to go and measure these things? If we all had infinite time, we could measure the entirety of the landscape, but resources are limited. And so in ecology, generally, we can only choose to the best of our ability the samples that are going to help us answer whatever the question is that we have. So for sampling strategy, this is cartoon cat. So we don't know anything about cartoon cat, and we're trying to understand what is the habitat of this fuzzy spotted guy, right? And we might say, well, other cats maybe have some relationship with elevation ranges. Some cats like it colder, some cats like it warmer, for example, or have an association with vegetation types that are found within different elevation bands. Or there might be other GIS layers like water bodies or land use or something else that that we think might relate to where we would find cartoon cat. And so the question is, where should I place camera traps if I have these different GIS layers? So anytime we have a question about, we've got a range of elevation ranges, we might hypothesize, well, somebody once saw a cartoon cat at the top of the Holyoke Range. And so maybe cartoon cat likes high elevation areas, right? If we actually want to test, though, whether this cat prefers high elevation, we can't just go and sample in the high elevation areas. We actually need to sample in both high elevation and low elevation areas, because if we find more of the cat in the high elevation areas than we do compared to the low elevation areas, then that gives us some insight about a preference for this cat. And if you guys remember back to your statistics classes that you've taken, right, there are statistical methods for comparing the frequency that we observe the cat, occurring in one area versus the numbers of occurrences in the other area to test whether those two things are significantly different, and tell us, yes, there is good probability that the cat likes high elevation versus low elevation. So that means that anytime we're designing a sampling strategy in GIS where we don't necessarily know anything about this habitat, but we might have a hypothesis, then we want to start by stratifying across whatever this gradient is. So for example, we think that the cat likes high elevation areas, but we want to take a transect from high elevation to low elevation so that we can test whether that is indeed true. Another wrinkle on this is that ideally we would want to hold other habitat variables constant, or as constant as we can get across a varied landscape. So for example, if I want to measure as purely as I can the cat's preference for these different elevation ranges, then I would also want to try to put my samples at a constant distance away from human domination, for example, a constant distance away from roads, because maybe the cats like or don't like roads and would be influenced by that as well. I would want to put all of my samples within ideally a constant land cover type, right? And similar sort of surrounding land cover types so that elevation is the main thing that I'm testing. So we can set that type of thing up within a GIS environment. One other thing that I want to talk about before we get to actually a GIS tutorial on this is how many samples we actually get to sample, right? So you could go to one location. So this is a little bit easier to imagine in sort of a plant survey type of thing. You could take a really big survey or a whole bunch of meter squared plots, but all in the same area, and kind of artificially have a whole bunch of different samples. And the reason that having multiple samples is important statistically, right, is that gives you more power to understand whether there are significant differences between occurrence in high elevations versus low elevations, for example. The challenge here, though, is that you can get your N, your number of samples, really high by easily taking lots of different samples in the same location. And so the question is, okay, if I look at this particular landscape, and let's say those are roads across 4 different very 80s style land cover types, this, if you look at it, seems like high numbers of samples because there are 250 samples in this image, but in reality what we're really doing is resampling the same point over and over again, right? So you've got this sort of clumping. In GIS land or in geography, what we refer to that is spatial autocorrelation. And so spatial autocorrelation is something that you have to be aware of when you're designing samples, because it means that when things are closer together, they're more likely to be similar to each other. And so, in fact, if you sample 2 plots that are right next to each other, you're probably just measuring the same thing twice. And that's not really an independent sample that you would need in order to actually test, does the cat, prefer high elevation, right? So if you have 2 cameras that are right next to each other and the cat walks past both of them, those are not 2 independent samples of 2 cats in an area, right? It's the same cat being sampled twice in the same location. So, for example, things that tend to have spatial autocorrelation are things like vegetation type, right? You're in a pine forest, you take a few steps to the right, you're probably still in a pine forest. Topography, right? So if you're in a high elevation area, the top of a mountain, take a few steps to the right, hopefully you're still at the top of the mountain. Rainfall, human demographic things like income level, right? So you tend to have poor areas, you tend to have rich areas. And if we want to get a good sample across topography, across land cover, then we want to try to expand our samples so that they're far enough apart that we're not effectively measuring the same thing twice. But there's a trade-off in terms of that far apart question, right? which is it takes a long time to get from one place to another. You might have to hike there or drive there and hike or something like that to get to these locations. And that takes a lot of time, it's expensive, and we ideally want to get as many samples as we can for low cost or as much as possible. So in GIS, and this is just to give you the information that such a thing exists, there is such a thing called a semi-variogram, which measures spatial autocorrelation. And basically what this does is semi-variance is basically the degree of error associated with or similarity between different points. And as you go further away from points, so whatever these units are, let's call them, meters or kilometers or something like that, then your variance increases, right? So those point locations are more different as you're further away than when you're really close together. These things are not that different at all. And so you can actually measure this in GIS and figure out through a whole bunch of different points and whatever, whether it's elevation or something else that you're calculating the variance against, measure a distance that's appropriate for sampling, right? So in this case, where this levels off, around 30 or something like that, is a place that now I can assume that spatial autocorrelation is going to be minimized, and I don't have to worry too much about resampling the same point over and over again, as long as I put my camera traps 30 or more, whatever units apart. So key take homes in terms of sampling strategy: stratifying against whatever the variable is that you're interested in understanding relative to habitat, while trying to hold other habitat variables as constant as possible. That we can use GIS to help select locations that fit those criteria, but keep an eye out for spatial autocorrelation and know that there are options within GIS to figure out how far apart you need to make your samples. All right, so this question of using GIS to help you select locations that fit your criteria. Well, let's go over to GIS and look at some of the layers that we've seen before. So these are layers that I pulled out of Lab 1. And we're going to use some tools that you're going to learn in Lab 7. And so this is the Mount Holyoke elevation grid, right? So any raster value on here, pixel value, is in, I think, meters above sea level, or meters above sea level, I think is what it is, right? So down in the Connecticut River, we're relatively low, up we're a few hundred meters up. All right, and I put towns on here just for reference so we can see Hadley and Amherst, and I also pulled roads in here because I think that one is relevant later on. So first thing that we want to create is a bunch of points, on this landscape that we could potentially sample across an elevation gradient. And what I'm going to use is create random points. So here's my create random points. And this is set up a little weird in that there's an output location. So let's call these random. I'm going to make 1,000 points. That seems like a good place to start. I do want to constrain the extents because I want them to be the same as my Mount Holyoke layer, right? I don't want these random points just like anywhere in the world. I want them to just be within that raster. And I want 1,000 points, and I don't know that any of the rest of this is relevant here. Okay, so this should create, a bunch of points basically within my raster grid. And right now these points have, no attributes associated with them. They're just in random locations, right? And some of them go a little off the grid just because the grid actually extends out to here. It's just that it has no data values out there. So definitely not interested in those. I'm then going to use another Lab 7 tool, which is extract values to points. I like extract multi-values to points because then it doesn't generate a new raster grid. So I'm going to call this elevation because that's what it is. And basically what this is doing is taking the value of the elevation and appending it onto the point data. So now when I open this up, I should see elevation over here. And I can also, find all of these nulls on here, which there's a fair number of them. And I'm actually just going to turn my editor on and press the delete button to get rid of those. Okay, so now I'm down less than 1,000. Right now I've got 879, but we've got all of these different elevational bands in here, right? So that's great, because if I wanted to choose from, some options in terms of elevation band, let's say I wanted to, find ones that are less than 100 or 100 to 200, 200 to 300, whatever it is, I can always use my, selections and choose my elevation of, less than or equal to 100, for example. And I can find all of those points that were options that are down at low elevation, and same thing for high elevation. The easier way, I think, sometimes to deal with this is actually to do a export and export this file as usually a text file. I was doing something else earlier, and call this random cat samples or whatever they're going to be, and then open this file in Excel so that I can mess around and find the points and stuff like that. Actually, another thing that's really useful here is to add my lat/lon directly in here. Those things are embedded in GIS, right? But they're not going to be embedded in Excel. So if I want this to be in decimal degrees, oops, the x coordinate is actually longitude. So the y coordinate is the one that I want for latitude. So there's my latitude. And here's my longitude. Now we're in X. Okay, so I've got that information now in here. So anytime I put this into Excel, I know I can, whatever I do with it later on, I can always bring it back into GIS using that display XY with my latitude and longitude. All right, so there's another question here, which is, all right, well, I've got 879 points to choose from. Let's say I might be able to actually sample, like 30 or 40 or something like that of these. Camera traps are expensive, so I can't afford 879 across the landscape. So another piece that I might want to do is a distance to roads, right? I'm just going to do this in rasterland. And do a Euclidean distance away from my roads. And this one is going to be important in terms of the cell size. I would rather my cell size be the same, exactly the same as Mount Holyoke, and that my cell size be the same as Mount Holyoke, which is a 30 meter, 29.3 meter pixel, rather than whatever GIS first selected. All right, so now it's going to work on spitting out a distance to roads, right? So these are farther from roads and these ones are closer to roads. Let's do my extract multi-values to points thing again. And now I've got my distance to roads, so I'm going to call this distance to roads. And And once that finishes flashing, I should now have another piece of information, right? Which is how far away from a road I am, right? So I've got a bunch of ones that are like basically right on top of a road, ones that are 30 meters from a road, and so on up, you know, to further away from a road. So for example, if I think that, you know, this cat doesn't really like people too much, but you know, I want to get it at least 100 meters away from a road, for example, then I might, but I don't want to go so far away from a road that that's going to be like a completely different landscape or something like that. So let's say I just want to sample things that are within the 100 to 200 meters away from a road. I can kind of see what that looks like. So the nice thing is that gives me a good distribution that's still encompassing a range of elevations. So I've got those ones selected. I'm actually just going to do a, on the shapefile, do a data export data just to, okay, so cat points 100 to 200 from the road. All right, so here's all my points again. All those same attributes should still be in there. And now I can think a little bit harder about this elevation range, right? So, okay, I've got a bunch of points that are less than 200 meters. I've got some points that are 200 to 300 meters, a few that are 300 to 400, and then there's less area higher up. So I just end up with fewer samples. So depending on what I wanted to do, and if I didn't have enough samples, I could just go back to where I started and make more random points, right? And do this process again. So make 2,000 or 3,000 or something. So I've got enough, enough options to choose from. So here, let's see. So for example, I have now a sample of 12 options that are between 100 and 200 meters away from a road, so a little bit of a walk, but not too unwieldy in that sense, and are also greater than 500 meters above sea level, right? So I could choose these as my samples for where I'm gonna put the camera trap at high elevation, and then maybe I wanna have some comparable ones, you know, at low elevation, and I choose, you know, some set down here that is comparable. So those are just some ideas about how you would actually operationalize this idea of sampling across different GIS criteria. A lot of it is doing lots of extractions and optimizing based on the things that you would like to try to hold constant, like distance to road, versus the thing that you would like to try to stratify against, like elevation. So hope that helps, and you are always welcome to try to follow these steps. These are all layers that are available from Lab 1.